We're going to get started here. We have, I think, most of the folks that we're expecting today, noting that Dr. Penny Beach is out of town and won't be joining us, but sent in their feedback ahead of time. Tammy and Joe are both out sick today. And then if Annie and Serena end up joining us, we'll be excited to welcome them. And then online, we're expecting Hillary is already online, and then B Black and Rebecca Lemon should both be joining us any second. So we're going to get started just because we have a lot to move through, and I want to make sure that we have enough time. Notably, I'll be your facilitator today instead of Jen. Jen is out of town, and in terms of urgency of just moving this task force to a conclusion, we thought it would be best to set this time that seemed to work for a majority of people, move through the finalization of the report. So I worked with Jen yesterday, walked through all the feedback, how we incorporated it, and then came up with a facilitation plan for today. And she just wanted me to pass along to you a reiteration of her thanks for participating and helping make this process, although challenging, like pretty easy for her in terms of how you all interacted with her. We'll start today with just a quick hello from Courtney, and then the plan is just moving through the report recommendations, intending to land on final places with periods on them so that we can move forward and get this report into the hands of city leadership and out into the community for public consumption. So I'll have Courtney just say a little hello first.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the last meeting. I think Andrew just made the joke that that would be a good title to a memoir, and I would agree. Thank you for your patience. We come before you with the last meeting that was requested and supported by the task force. So Casey's gonna do his best to work us through all of the feedback we got. And then at the end of the meeting, I'll just close with next steps and to try to answer any questions folks may have. So thanks again and welcome.
Perfect. So the first thing that we're going to do is you all have a copy of the report. That is the first document that you have in front of you. This is yours to take with you. After today, we'll be working on incorporating any additional edits that come through this group's conversation and direct consensus from the group, as folks have already had their opportunity to provide input and individual feedback on the report. And then it will be put into like City of Boise branding. So this is just my very sad Word document version of it. This afternoon, the community engagement team will put it, I'm assuming, into nice colors and fonts that match the city branding guidelines. And then you have 3 other documents in front of you that I think should help us move through the conversation. And I'll just name what those are before we get into it. The first one is what I'm calling tier 1 input, and that's where we'll end up starting. Tier 1 input is here in this document because from my standpoint, it was really easy to incorporate because it fell into one of 3 categories. Either one, it was easy to accept and adjust the language because there was both consensus from the group and alignment with our best practices. So if any of those comments left kind of that criteria, they were immediately incorporated. Then there was the second bucket, which is reject, that it lacked a group consensus. It was stemming more from an individual comment as opposed to a group conversation that occurred, and it lacked alignment with best practices. Or a stuck. So this bucket was also incredibly easy, where we had competing ideas on 2 sides. It became clear that we wouldn't get to group consensus, and therefore what we put into the report was that we did not reach consensus. And I think if you'll recall, the mayor said that she didn't necessarily need consensus from this group, but just a representation of what this group's thinking was. So we'll take some time with this, but the tier 1 feedback, what you'll see, we'll walk through that in a second. And then there are 2 larger conversations that I thought we could have today where it really seemed like we have to get more closer to consensus in terms of how we're accurately and adequately representing the feelings of this group. So those conversations are going to be on the multi-site potential, and we have 1 page explicitly about that. And then we have one other one that is the engagement timeline. And so we'll plan to spend more in-depth conversation in those 2 areas. But the first thing that I'd like to do is move through the tier 1 comments. And I will note that we only had 4 individuals give feedback in the time that we asked for that feedback. And I would say that 2 of those individuals provided really minimal feedback, meaning less than 2 comments. And the other 2 individuals provided either a letter corresponding to the report that was pointing to some larger questions or really extensive feedback. So while this may look like this is the feedback that we got from the entire task force, know that it was really driven by a couple of folks. And I just want to name that so it's really clear to you all, like what level of feedback we're talking about when it comes to the group conversation. So to move through tier one, what I'm asking you all to do, I know that there's a lot of information here, is to just take a minute, and by a minute, I mean 5 to 8, read through this. And what I'd like you to do as you're reading through this is just make any notes to yourself where you have an outstanding question. Knowing that the framework for this is we believe that they were easier to incorporate. The formatting is what was the general set of comments or individual comment. That middle column is then what are our incorporations notes, which will give you not only what did we do to incorporate it, but exactly where in the report we incorporated that. And then the final column is added or adjusted language. And so we put in underline there any of the language that we changed to adjust to that comment. And if it was adding an entirely new section, we put add new section. So I'm just going to ask you to take some time now to work through this, identifying explicitly like where you have outstanding questions or where this can like cause like a larger conversation that you want to have with the group. So 5 to 8 minutes doing that, and then we'll come back to questions that y'all have. Then just as kind of Andy and Steph are doing, signaling to me when you're done by just giving me like a nod, like, hey, I'm ready, would be helpful. I say let's wrap up in the next minute or so if folks can. All right, we'll get started here just as the majority of people are done. So the question is, what do you all have as you reviewed this tier 1 input? Either as questions, concerns, things that don't feel like they're representative of the conversations you've been having.
Thank you. Just looking at the final recommendation for report feedback, I think it's an appendix. There's one word that I question only because we never voted or took any direct indications, but in the first sentence says there was broad interest from the task force members to have interface sanctuary evaluate the feasibility of operating multi-site shelter
Andy,
system.
that's right on, but I'm going to have you hold that for
Okay.
So we're going to have multi-site explicitly as a really long conversation.
Okay.
So right
Good.
now we're just.
I will wait.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. And then we have, so right now, just as a reminder, we're just in this segment, tier 1, because I'm trying to move past what felt like they were easy to incorporate based on the group conversation you all have had and fielding questions about this. Go ahead, Jody. And then I saw Elaine. And then if other folks want to get on, just send me your hand so I can start keeping a stack.
We're doing intake right now for the COVID hotel, and my other staff member is sick today. So if I'm walking out, it's to manage the COVID intakes. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Perfect. Thank you. Go ahead, Elaine.
Thanks, Casey. Just a note about one word. I just want to clarify what this means, and it would be on the conditional use permit language and the last sentence saying the city of Boise should take additional steps alongside conditional use permits for shelters to provide robust support with public engagement. And I guess that to me, it's a little unclear what it is that we expect the shelters to provide robust support for. If it's the accountability to the conditions, we ought to just say that.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I can do some clarifying of language, and the intention there was there were 2 additional comments from folks about we need to understand the conditional use permit process. So the intention of that language is to say that the city of Boise and city staff in particular should take additional steps when it comes to conditional use permits for shelters. to support more robust public engagement processes.
Yeah.
So I'll do some clarifying to make it clear this isn't about what the shelters need to do in that process, because that's pretty clearly defined through the community board engagement part that we have and the CUP process for community engagement, and make it clear that this is the city of Boise's role.
Thank you.
Additional things. Oh, B has a comment, so I'm going to pass it over to B. And B
Thanks,
should,
Casey. Yeah, thank you. I think that you did a good job of laying out the different areas of feedback and making the changes. I have to admit, I got a little bit lost trying to go from my notes on the first version of the final report to this next version where there were no page numbers and no sub numbers in terms of, you know, the different categories, the different groupings. I did want to make sure that one change, which I think is a pretty important change, and I don't believe I saw it changed in the updated version. And that was under the housing first approach, where we talk about the duration of stay should not be limited. I believe that word should have been duration of stay should not be unlimited. An effective shelter achieves shorter lengths of stay where households exit to permanent housing. And I apologize, I was struggling trying to find that same statement in the update, but I think that is an important change that needs to be made.
yeah, no, that's great. And that, thank you for reminding me, because that came through our last set of conversations. I didn't highlight it as the feedback we received after the fact, but the way that that is under shelter best practices, under the housing first approach, which I'm now recognizing there is no page numbers nor categorization of these. The second bullet point under that says duration of stay should not be limited. An effective shelter achieves shorter lengths of stay where households exit it to permanent housing.
Right.
So I think what we made more clear that it should not be limited, and then still tied that to the concept of the role of housing, or the role of shelter is to achieve exits to permanent housing. And then the third bullet point there also says that the role of shelter and housing are distinct and should remain distinct. So we kind of attacked it in two different ways. Does
Okay.
that meet the intention of the edit that you wanted to see?
No, but if that is what that is meant to say, then I guess that is okay. I thought, anyway, and
No.
the other thing is I was uncomfortable with, and I liked some of where I thought the recommended language was going. And that has to do with the 300 feet that's being considered with the conditional use permit. But I guess that is something that we can bring forward at the conditional use permit planning process if we don't agree with that. So I'll leave that for another day.
Yeah,
I
no,
think that's very restrictive, especially if we're going to start trying to find siting for other smaller shelters to help offload some of the populations that we've talked about that need more supportive housing.
no, those are both really good points. And let's go back to your first one. What is it that you'd want that bullet point to say, so that because I don't think that I'm clear on the desired edit.
I thought the premise was that an emergency shelter should in best practice should not be unlimited length of stay, because the whole idea is that we are helping individuals be housed. We're working actively to help get them housed. Now, unlimited still, or limited. Yeah, unlimited still doesn't mean that that you have any set date on it. We haven't said it should be limited to X amount of time, but I just thought that was the tenor of what the intent was.
Okay, great. So let's pause there, and then I'll throw it back out to the group to see because this is what we're going to do as we have different opinions. What's the group reaction to the language as it's written, and B, hoping to see us put that it should not be unlimited. I see a Jody, and then I see a Jeanette.
So I guess my question is, because in best practices for the housing first shelter approach, what they're asking for us is that there's no timeout, meaning that in 18 days, if you've not engaged in programming, you must leave our facility. So I think the two are different. I think what B is trying to say is that best practices for us is to prioritize housing as soon as possible, which we do by connecting with Catch for any intake immediately to get them into the housing process. I think those are two different ideas. One is asking us as a shelter to not ask someone to leave because they haven't achieved certain things by a certain time.
Okay.
Correct.
That was really, this is Jet with Outreach. That was really my point too, that, I mean, there's the housing first philosophy that it's not a permanent solution, but then we also have to deal with the reality that set time limits can be really damaging to our folks, especially in this housing market.
Okay. So I'm going to take that. I think that that is clear to me, and I'm going to come back, or I will incorporate the language that is specifically on industry language, which is about not having a timeout, and have that concept incorporated as a focus, as opposed to focusing on limited or unlimited. Does that sound okay to folks in B?
Yeah, thank you. I think that does clarify it because I think there's a difference. I guess I was trying to pay attention to what I hear the neighbors saying. And at the same time incorporate, because you're absolutely right. If we are an effective shelter, we are achieving shorter lengths of stay. So,
Perfect.
thank you.
That's great. And then on your second point on residential buffer, that is included in this tier 1. And the reason is we will not reach consensus because you are among a couple of members who have provided us that they think that it is overly limiting and they don't want to see it incorporated for this shelter, nor in the zoning rewrite that occurs with the city of Boise. Then we had like a middle tier of feedback that said, we would love to see it, but we'd love to see it scaled at different levels that allow shelter to be in more residential areas as they get smaller. And then we saw a third tier of feedback that said, we want to see it and we want to see the buffer be even bigger for bigger shelters. So it's clear to me we're not going to get consensus on that. And so the language in the report reflects the attitudes of different task force members and what they voiced, and that we did not reach consensus there. And so that's kind of why it's on this list. I don't think it's worth spending a lot more time because I don't think we're going to move along that spectrum of opinion.
No, and I totally agree with that. Thank you. There's a different forum for that. Thanks, Casey.
Yeah, of course. And then I would also note that on that, and then as it relates to the conditional use permit, there was like also a desire in the feedback to say like these are separate processes and that the one was not influenced by the other. Or I think in the staging of things, the conditional use or the code rewrite was not influenced by this process. And so we inserted additional language, which you all see here, that says that process was not influenced by this and this process was influenced by that. But we obviously didn't include that language because it's clear we're referencing it. Other things in the tier 1. Sorry, grab a mic.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about the coordinated entry process. I think that the recommendation to have an offsite coordinated entry could allay some neighborhood concerns about overflow of people seeking shelter for whom there's no space in that shelter. And the response here says it's not client focused or person first, but in my view, the coordinated entry system should be engaging holistically and then directing people to the appropriate shelter so they don't have to shop around town looking for a space themselves. So I'm a little confused by that rejection.
Yeah, so I can speak to that and then I'm going to toss it back to the group. So we incorporated the coordinated entry process because it is clear that in the best practices from our folks that Interfaith talked about and that the National Alliance to End Homelessness, that there should be some type of prioritization that prevents a first come, first serve business model or entry model that allows us to make sure that we are serving the most vulnerable members or guests that need access to shelter. The off-site was first unclear, I think, because I don't know off-site means who would take this on. So I think I saw Stephanie's hand go up and she'll definitely talk about that. But what we're talking about client-centered is if someone shows up at your door because they've heard, which is oftentimes how people show up at emergency shelters, and then you say, well, no, you have to go over to this other place and then they'll let you know if you can come back. It's an unnecessary step that's not centering the person at your door that's accessing a night-by-night crisis resource, but it's telling them that they have to follow a process that is different. And then it creates extra steps. And that's part of like what is the trauma-informed process that our Path Home tries to move through is that you try to meet people with service right when they show up at your door, and that you don't force them to move from one place to another if it's not immediately necessary, and you reduce the number of times that they're storytelling. So if they come and tell a story at your door and then you send them somewhere else to tell a story, and then they end up coming back, all you've done is cause like 2 additional layers of trauma in that storytelling. And Steph, I saw you, and then anybody
Yeah.
else who has thoughts on this can raise their hand so I can see.
Sure. I'm Stephanie with Catch, and we house the coordinated entry location. And I think this is probably just nuanced wording that is the issue here. But yeah, so coordinated entry currently is not 24 hours and 365 days a year. So it's only open from like 10 to 3:30, I think right now, or 4. So if someone experienced homelessness and needed to access a shelter after our business hours, there wouldn't be a place for them to go. So I think as far as like if we're saying it has to be through the coordinated entry system, that probably does not functionally work. However, the shelters do coordinated entry amongst themselves. So like if someone shows up at the Mission and they're full, they'll call Jody and vice versa, and WCA. So there is a coordinated access process. Like when someone shows up at a shelter, if there's not space, all of the shelters do try to navigate that together. It just doesn't happen at the actual coordinated entry site. So I think it's just like nuanced phrasing. And I think that really the heart of what you're trying to get at does happen. It just happens in a different place.
Oh, yeah. The actual language, sorry, again, this would have been helpful for Roman numerals or something, is under shelter better practices, low barrier. And it's the last bullet point, and it says shelter adopts clear coordinated entry process for emergency shelter that prioritizes households with the most need and prevents first come, first serve access to shelter. And I think the request was add that process necessitate it occurring off-site at some other location that wasn't identified, and that process be the singular place where shelter entry happens, full stop. And I think the intention is you don't get overflow or rejection of folks onto street. And I think that's where Stephanie says, force people who are seeking shelter, if there are other options available, they do that coordinated entry process between one another. And then,
So,
Elaine and then
in
Jet.
response to that, then I would say I agree that nuancing this language a little bit to say, yes, every shelter should have some process for entry. And at the end of the day, it should all be part of the coordinated entry system, right? And I'm not going to wordsmith it, but I think that's the intention, if I'm not mistaken.
Then, okay. And then I saw Jet. And so we might have a non-consensus here because I think this is where it moves past where we're talking, and then at administrative level, I think I can easily incorporate every shelter should have a process, and those processes should be outlined. It occurring at coordinated entry, which is a physical location that's staffed by people that's not 24/7, is not logistically possible now. And I think that there's like a lack of consensus from what I can see from Katie and Elaine, and a desire for that potentially to be true.
No, I think you misunderstood what I
Okay.
said. I think they should have coordinated entry on site, but at the back end of it, there should be coordination with
Across.
the coordinated entry process.
Okay, that's super helpful.
And Casey, I think it might be missing the value proposition, which is to ensure that no shelter is overwhelmed, right? I think to Katie's point, that's the concern of the neighborhood, is the cause of not having coordinated entry. So I think with that addition, we're okay, but we lost so that one shelter isn't overwhelmed, which would be obvious to people who do this every day, but not necessarily someone just reading the report for the first time.
Perfect. And then I saw Jet, and then I saw a move from Jody and Katie. And then I'm going to ask us after that to land this particular segment. Go ahead, Jet.
This recommendation may have already been covered, but it's just the language. Coordinated entry is a specific function in our continuum of care. So maybe we could call what this triage process at the shelter something different to avoid that confusion.
That's helpful.
That's exactly what I was going to speak to too. Coordinated entry is to put anyone who has entered into the homeless system into a queue for housing. It's not for shelter. It's to identify most vulnerable and also categorize by criteria who might be eligible for what. And so in the shelter system, when someone's entering into our system, it's an urgent night by night intake process that is coordinated between the shelters themselves. Transportation is provided if necessary. And oftentimes, if someone's not able to come into a shelter when it's low barrier, it is because there's not enough beds. And so hopefully with increased beds, you increase that risk of not being able to serve people.
Great. So hearing all of that, I feel like I have a clear direction, but I know that Katie had a response here. And I again encourage you, listening to the conversation headed towards consensus, couching your comment in the conversation that folks are having would be helpful.
I just wanted to note that my understanding is Boise's work has recently, in the last several months, been working on rolling out, an overarching phone number, like the first stop phone number to call when you're experiencing homelessness and are in need of services. So my understanding was that that number would then, sometimes direct to Jesse Tree and sometimes direct to shelter. And I do understand the comment about 24-hour access, but it seems like that number could then be routed to a shelter desk if shelters are open 24/7 and they could be managing that for overnight calls. I just continue to be concerned that if you're just expected to hear of a shelter and go knock on that specific door, that seems like an added level of potential for overcrowding of one specific shelter in the system.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. I feel like I have what I need from all of you to write what I hear as consensus language around this. So we're gonna land that plane there. And then is there anything else in this document that folks want to talk about, knowing that we have two other conversations, one which is on multi-site and one which is on the timeline for engagement, which both have tension points around them. I'm going to do what Jen does. I'm giving it a beat and a breath. Great. So I'll stay after today if anyone wants to have an additional discussion about things that are here one-on-one, but seeing general group consensus being that this looks pretty clearly representative, I'm feeling really good about it. So we're going to move to the next thing. And this is where Andy's been waiting for, the multi-site. So I pulled this out because there is a larger conversation to have here. And so I'm going to ask you to read this quickly. And the question I'm going to ask you at the end is, are we adequately covering the group conversation here? There has been a conversation about multi-site from the first day, if any of you recall, in a couple of opening comments, a desire to move through this process. This language is our best attempt to capture how that conversation was expressed from some task force members, how that conversation was addressed through presentations from our national experts, from the emergency shelter operator that this task force was developed around, and then where we landed on that. So I'm going to ask folks to take a minute to read this and then answering the question, did we adequately cover?
Casey, I just have a flag, and I don't know if this rings true to folks. The term multi-site seems to mean many different things to many different people. So it would at least be helpful for me, Casey, for you to define it in the way you believe this represents, because I've heard it referred to, and it's clear there's not a common definition and or use of this term. So if you could just, one, that's a flag, because many of you may have been using this term and meaning something different than it means to others. So if you could just, in this context, take a minute and explain what you mean by multi-site.
Yeah, I would love to do that. And that is part of the problem, is that it's not clear. And so the last paragraph here addresses that, in that it remains unclear to us what task force members mean when they reference it, because they could mean, as many have directly meant in particularly I think in Tom and Annie's presentation to Jody, called on Interfaith Sanctuary to reevaluate this model. And in that instance, a multi-site shelter would be a single operator operating multi-sites that are divided in some way. And then there is a other thread of multi-site that is, I don't care who's operating it, but there should just be smaller shelters. And that is my definition of multi-site. And it's unclear who the shelter operator is in that instance, because it's clearly not Interfaith Sanctuary based on their organizational standpoint on operation of multi-site shelters. And so then I would have like 1,000 follow-up questions on like the who, the how, and the why. So it's really hard to define it. And that's part of the reason that it's not exceedingly clear here from the beginning and why I don't feel comfortable putting forward a definition. But what I can do, hearing that comment, is add in where it says it's unclear how this would operate as a practical matter, especially without a low barrier shelter operator. I could say a single or multiple low barrier shelter operator partners, because it could be either of those two things. Other things that folks want to say about this?
Casey, I think I heard an undercurrent in some of the conversations around multi-site. And if I'm wrong, please, everyone correct me, that it also was looking at the potential to serve various kinds of sheltered guests at one site, and would it make more sense to serve them in separate or disaggregated facilities some way? And like I say, that because it's so unclear what this means, I may be wrong, but that's the other undercurrent I seem to hear.
No, that's a great point. That was not included, and I will include that because now that you're saying that, that is clearly part of people's motivation. In particular, is like, how do you bifurcate populations among specific needs to create shelter environments that are exclusive to those populations? So I'll add that note in here. Then I saw Tom, and I know Andy's on.
Are we taking a minute to read this first?
Yes. Sorry.
I'll then comment after that.
Okay. Yeah. So let's pause so that folks have a time to just make sure that you've reviewed. Seeing most folks' eyes back up. So I'm going to throw it back to Tom. Thanks for that pause. I think that was helpful. And then throw it over to Andy.
So this is Tom from Sunset. So we've talked about this. We've mentioned this a couple of times. The zoning rewrite and zoning is a separate issue. Then we don't want to kind of conflict things. But to me, this the multi-site potential it is part of that conversation, because the way I understand zoning right now in Boise, it doesn't matter if we want to have multi-site potential. It's impossible to do it right now. And the way that the zoning rewrite is going is making it harder. So to me, it's almost, while I personally would like to see a multi-site, and the feedback I get from a lot of people are what that definition is we can have that conversation too. It doesn't matter at this point because it's basically impossible.
Okay, so I'm going to make that note on this paper, but I'll try to find a way to reference that as it's connected to the zoning code rewrite, because we do have some language in there about how the city of Boise should approach that zoning rewrite. And I think what I'm hearing from you is it's not just about the residential buffers, but it's also about how that zoning codes enables alternatives for shelter, including smaller sites to be sited in different land spaces. Is that right?
Exactly. For example, like a lot of the multi-site people talk about is having small shelters throughout different neighborhoods, which would then be impossible. You can't put it in the neighborhoods because of zoning.
Okay, perfect. Thank
At
you.
least that's the way I understand it. I'm also not a zoning genius.
Me neither, but I get it. I'll throw that in there. Go ahead, Andy.
Thank you. I was just questioning the word broad and interest. There was well articulated interest and even, support from a couple of task force members that I heard. We never took a vote. I didn't hear it from a lot of people. The ones I did hear did a nice job, but I don't want to convey the idea that this was a broad interest across the task force. So I think there was interest from task force members. Okay, some task force members, something like that, rather than just articulating it that way.
Yeah, and let's do a little group check. Is my definition of broad is let's just try this. Group, like raise your hand if at one point you've indicated an interest in exploring multi-site. And I know Annie did. Elaine, your hand should be up. Because Elaine asked us to look at innovative solutions as well. So I think even in this room, and who? Yeah.
This is multi-site for interfaith. I think, for instance, Councilmember Clegg had talked about something that could be a different model of many sites, but this particular, I'm just referencing interfaith operating multi-site. That's the way this is written.
And that leads back then to Courtney's question about what do we mean by multi-site? So distinguishing in that first sentence, broad interest in multi-site that was bifurcated into major pathways. One, interfaith sanctuary operating multi-sites, and having some unknown entity or process for having multiple site emergency shelter operators in a multitude of sites. That's easy. Okay. And B wants to make a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. I think that clarifying, because I think the two multi-sites are very distinct, and the multi-site that I believe was at the heart of the comments of this group had to do with emergency shelter being smaller in multiple sites across the city, versus when I think the other version of multi-site is that we have different sites that can serve populations with different needs, which I think right now, Interfaith Sanctuary, out of necessity, is serving all populations regardless of needs, thank goodness. And so I think to just further clarify multi-site makes an awful lot of sense. And I think what Elaine said and what Andy said, I think working that in will help a reader who has no idea what it means understand where the group is coming from.
Okay, that's helpful. So now it'll be an interfaith sanctuary, and then it'll be multi-site that are defined by two ways: multiple smaller shelters, and second, like shelters that have population-specific services, and recognizing that there's a ton of nuance here.
Yeah, thank you.
Andy, did I see your hand? Andrew, sorry.
I'm only Andy in the state of Illinois.
Okay.
It seems to me to that point, and Andy got what I wanted to say, which was there's a difference between defraying the impact of interfaith and a future orientation. This document is all about future orientation. And in that sense, what B is talking about, if in a needs analysis, the recommendation of leadership meet the need for emergency shelter needs analysis, there could be a fourth point under there very easily that said, would there be better shelter access if we had more low barrier shelters in the long range? And then that does nothing to do with interfaith's model or this particular shelter, which this document has actually steered clear of in its entirety.
Okay. So what I'll do then, hearing this, is I'm going to make the intro context about the interfaith story, because I think in comments, it was clear there was desire to talk about that specifically, and the task force did not go in that direction and representing that story, and then pivot to that multi-site could mean any number of these things forward looking and have that be a standalone, so that there is kind of like the story of what was not discussed here as it comes to multi-site, and then what should be discussed moving forward as it comes to multi-site. Anything that feels like an absolute, I'm not sure that we can land there.
One just quick point to Andy's comment about the word broad. I wonder if you could consider an alternative of various. There was various interest. which I think gets at more what there really was.
Perfect.
Because it wasn't, I don't think, even a majority, well, it was probably majority, but it was so varied. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks.
Anything else that I think, again, going back to the original question, knowing I have one more thing to talk about, anything that's not adequately captured in here in light of all the changes that we'll make to this section to represent a pretty varied interest in multi-site. Katie?
I would just say that the final paragraph, the language about it's unclear how as a practical matter this could be explored. I feel that that has kind of a negative connotation, and maybe replacing it with the task force did not explore as a practical matter how this would work with funding, development, and operations.
Okay, yeah, I think that's totally fine. Good note there. I think you're hearing there more of my city staff thing, like, I don't know how to explore this going forward, but I'll reverse that and have it be task force language because I think that's absolutely appropriate. Okay, landing the plane on multi-site. Going once. Not going to do twice or sold. We're just moving on. Okay, and I'll tell you all, this is the last larger conversation we have to have. And to me, it's an incredible sign that we only had two major conversations that I felt that we needed to have where there didn't seem like we could land it without feeling like I was confident in making the changes to recommendations. So I want to like applaud this group on that. This last piece is really small and it's just the engagement timeline. The reason I cannot land the plane here in any way other than what's laid out is because there are competing interests among not only individuals on the task force, but even members of the group from feedback that we received about what that group actually decided. And that leads to the larger thread of conversation that we were having last time, where multiple members on the task force talked about the impossibility of public input as aligned with any realistic timelines for the implementation of shelter as it moves through various stages of siting, which go from community conversations through CUP through like approval of CUP and then dating back to like, how do you even scope land? How do you buy land? How do you buy a building? So I just wanted to walk you through the way that I ended up landing it that I feel like meets the highest need or the highest expressed value interest from this group. So the first thing is a shelter, obviously, operator has interest in a particular area. And I think they have a couple of ways that they can move through that. One of the things that I've heard is, well, they shouldn't buy a building until they know for sure that they can use it. And I think what we've heard and what I understand from being in the nonprofit sector, you don't necessarily have capital on capital just to buy buildings without leveraging some assets. That's kind of what happened here. In any future case, it would take some type of public funding if we wanted to move through a public input process before a shelter operator, where some public entity was willing to buy a space, hold that space, go through the process, and then pass it over to some shelter operator. So that's kind of where, as a practical matter thing, comes through with the multi-site. So in this instance, we're using Interfaith Sanctuary as the model, but also extrapolating that to any future model. A shelter operator would buy a space. They then do community engagement. That community engagement is necessarily tied to the CUP process. And what I heard from that group on the community criteria is that that community engagement should be far more structured. And the structure of that community engagement can come through the development of a community engagement board. And the role of that board, as it's described, would work throughout that conditional use permit process that requires community engagement to hold conversations with community neighbors in pretty broad ways, and then report those findings together as a board as like, these are the needs and concerns from the neighborhood. That is kind of the role of the shelter already as it's defined in the CUP process, but this expands their role to then develop a board that does that work with them. The next step that was suggested by that group is a proactive emergency and safety plan. This is tied to a conditional use permit process that is ongoing. This is for two reasons. One, It is already part of a conditional use permit process. Different agencies have to submit feedback reports or impact reports based on any project that's coming through with a conditional use permit. The suggestion here was go beyond that and say that those agencies would work together not only to issue individual impact reports, but develop collective reports together about how will we work together. And I think this is where you heard Jeanette and Jody say, there are working groups on street outreach that are composed of those actors already. What would it look like for them to come together and say, hey, we know that the shelter is putting a CUP on for this site. This is what those things would look like in real time, not just saying Boise Police Department could shift, but the Boise Police Department saying, this is how we would shift to meet the service need here. That would go alongside the Our Path Home evaluation. This process is explicitly for an expert body of individuals to say, do we think that this meets the standards that we've set for ourselves or not? That there was desire to have that be public input, but I took that out because it's inherently a separate process, and that body of individuals doesn't have the capacity nor structure to engage a public input process. So they will do work that is within the standards of Our Path Home to say, this is how we're using things like this report to develop evaluation and say what we think of the project. That would be used in the conditional use permit process. Then there's a conditional use permit decision that comes with a whole bunch of public engagement, which we said the city of Boise should take a role in developing more robust public engagement support so that people can get engaged in that process. And it would be informed by the things that were developed ahead of that. Then there's the Good Neighbors Agreement. So the Good Neighbors Agreement, as we understand it, is after a conditional use permit process has been approved and it says, yes, we will be in this city, we will be in this neighborhood. That is the time to set up a permanent structure for, okay, we're going to be here. Let's sit down and develop the long-term structure. And that might be the same folks that were involved in the Community Engagement Board, or it might be entirely different folks. The nature of a Good Neighbors Agreement is about a definitive answer of we will be here and definitive planning for what we will do together. And we created the room for, it's likely that some people who are on the Community Engagement Board might not be interested in that long-term thing. They might have just been more interested in the fight to keep the shelter out. And that's just plain clear facts. That Good Neighbors Agreement has the additional opportunity to develop a long-term advisory board. And then finally, conditional use permit enforcement. This is a really clearly defined process, as Elaine said, and folks wanted more information about the conditions of conditional use permit. And I would just point you back to that process. The first word in that inherently is condition. They are laid out pretty explicitly there. And then there's enforcement code. And one thing that I think in the Our Path Home evaluation that would be added is a potential for Our Path Home to come back and look at their evaluation after implementation and check in with the shelter as an operator to see how they're doing. So I'm going to pause here, but the things I want to say are, this is already an incredible amount of engagement without considering the shelter task force. The main desire that I heard was that community engagement board should be permanent. And I heard that from one individual, and it's in direct conflict with feedback that we got from 2 other people within the task force. So this is, I think, where I did my best work to lay out logically, how does this move forward? And so I would ask you all, what are major flags you have here? See, Tom?
This is Tom from Sunset. I think the one that I think actually did a pretty good job of laying that out. I think it was my group that had this mostly. The Our Path Home evaluation, part of our thought, if I remember correctly, was more along the lines of, well, no, there's an evaluation, but in addition, Our Path Home would, these 5 bullet points you have on here would before this process ever started again, before there was ever any other interfaith sanctuary, other group looking at homeless shelters, they would take these 5 bullet points and make a much larger and more detailed plan going ahead forward. These are just kind of our broad recommendations. And then they would whatever that word is, be more specific going forward on what that plan would be. Does that make sense?
Could you say it in a different way? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll say it in a different way. We had these 5 bullet points, but Our Path Home would have a much more detailed description of what should be done in the future for all these bullet points.
Okay.
So basically what I'm saying is the people who know what they're doing spend time make an evaluation process for all the, the entire process, laying it out going forward.
Okay.
The goal is to avoid the type of stuff we're seeing right now.
Okay. I'm gonna hold on to that. And then I saw Jody and then I saw Katie.
One of the things that I think would be really helpful, and this goes back to the kind of community engagement by the city to help neighbors understand process, is there was a lot of concern when we did our public engagement beyond what was required through the CUP, that they wanted the police there, they wanted the fire department there, they wanted the city there to stand alongside us and be responsible for answering questions that we couldn't answer. And what we learned is that until a conditional use permit gets to a certain point, that's not appropriate for these agencies to step in. And so it looked like we were kind of dodging, but I think if there's a clear understanding about that timeline for when you can actually get those real answers, it would really help any project look transparent. And also there's an understanding about, okay, we're going to go through this, and then here's when we're going to learn about this, here's when we're going to learn about this, and here's when we're going to learn about this.
Great. So those two things combined give me like a flow idea for how this works. And then I saw Katie, and then I saw Andrew, and I saw Courtney, and we are at time currently, which I also want to name. So let's land these potentially quickly and be.
For the Our Path Home evaluation, I think I heard a different thing in what that means than Tom did. My understanding was that the Our Path Home would be effectively creating a matrix for site evaluation and selecting criteria and putting together a scoring system. So hearing that there couldn't be any public engagement in what that matrix looked like was a concern to me.
Yeah, hear that concern. And I don't think that that concern holds larger consensus based on the overwhelming opportunity for this report to influence what that evaluation would look like and in fact dictate the creation of those criteria and then the additional public input opportunity. So that concern, I think, was noted in the tier 1, and I just don't think that there was consensus to say that definitely needs to be opened up. Andrew.
I guess I'd be tempted to say, to stretch where Tom went and push it a little further and say, I think our recommendation should be that Our Path Home and the city come up with a timeline that's clearly stated and it involve these events. But I don't know that we're capable right now of knowing exactly which piece goes where in that timeline, because there are things we just don't have the information.
That's what I meant to say.
Great work, Tom. No, great. Thank you, Andrew. And then Courtney.
My only comment is I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to make sure this outreach is super clear and what role is appropriate for the city versus a private entity making a decision.
Yep.
So the city doesn't trigger the decision to site a shelter. So there's a space where it's inappropriate for the city to intervene. While I agree doing a much better job of being clear when the city's engagement is, who it is, whether it's the police or fire or the council or who it is. But I want to make sure it doesn't give the impression that the city can manage community outreach events on decisions it itself doesn't make. So,
Yep.
and with that, if it's all right, because I'm about to run late for a really important meeting, I just wanted to go over next steps real quick. So Casey is somehow going to magically make this all work by the end of the day. We plan on releasing this report today. I'm scheduled to do an overview of this report with the city council on Tuesday at a work session, which will be streamed for anybody who wants to see it. In addition, I'm happy to provide that presentation to any other entities in which you think it might be helpful. And then with that, I just want to make sure and take the time to recognize both Casey and Rachel for all their work. So round of applause. And thank you, everyone, for what's been a really, really good process. And I think a lot of learning on everyone's behalf. And now I have to leave, Casey, but if you have more wrap up, that's fine.
No, I think if anyone else has burning stuff, we can hold for that. But the only other next step that I would add to this is that we will, or I will, be reaching out to each of you to schedule or to offer you time to schedule a one-on-one with me to do just a process exit interview. And my intention is, this is obviously my first time doing a task force. I am now like 4 months into the city of Boise. This was a wild thing to learn through. And we heard a lot of consternation generally about the process. And I know that the city of Boise regularly does task force, and other folks who run task force are reaching out to us because, and I encourage you to do this, go look at any other task force at the city of Boise. What you'll see is a page and their final report, and that is all the information that you have. So we've done a lot more work on public engagement and transparency here, and we have a lot more to learn. So I want to take the opportunity to sit down with y'all if you want, where I will just ask you questions about the process. You'll give me feedback, and then I'll turn that into a task force recommendations thing that we will pass around to all other city staff that engage in task force development. So it's you've already made your impact. You have the opportunity to make an additional impact if you'd like about the future of task force work for the city of Boise.
When we went through and made our comments in the last section, B had a point she wanted to make. She typed it up and make sure you write it down. It was a good one. So.
Oh, B says, I thought our path home would be where the process starts.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is, I think,
If you have a just 30 seconds, my thought was that our path home could come up with a process, and the city, as far as looking at the conditional use permit, could look and see, has whoever's applying for whatever it is gone through and gotten the our path home, followed that process and gotten their stamp of approval. And then we kind of start through a lot of the community engagement, because none of us can say to a business person, you can't go over and have this idea and buy this property and think about starting a shelter, right? Necessarily. Yeah. But if you understand through either city or our path home that here's how the process works around here, if you want to get through the conditional use permit, public engagement, you need to start with in this manner. So I was just trying to say is maybe there's a way that we can be of assistance and we come out with a plan in conjunction with some of the ideas that have come up through this task force of here are the steps that people have to work through if they kind of want to get going on this and have the backing of our path home.
Great. And I think I saw Tom nodding their head that was the intention. So I'll make that adjustment. And what I'll do is, I can't promise you that this will be like, this process takes exactly 3 weeks. But what I will do is lay these out and put just like a 1-sentence intention, and then include this as an additional appendix in the report so that people can see. And I'll make that shift for the our path home to evaluation to be at the beginning, noting that does, it'll be just a slight change in intention, because then the our path home body is just evaluating the site, not including any type of community input, because that community input will necessarily not have been gathered until the development of a community engagement board. And so it's just a process recommendation. And I think it'll ultimately be up to the our path home partnership to figure out when is that process best placed, because there is like the neighborhood perception often in cases like this, and this would make it real, that our path home has already stamped its approval on this, and why are we even doing community engagement then? And then there's like a nerve. So it's a line of, when do experts step in and voice opinion, and do they do that before the public or after? So I'll make that shift in here, but it might be, as with most things in this, subject to change at some future date. Okay. I think we've landed the plane sufficiently here, knowing that we don't have like total consensus. Any closing remarks from y'all as we'll rush to incorporate these edits today?
If I could just say quickly, and be to you online, whoever else is listening, thank you everyone for participating so honestly, so diligently, and with such passion. Really appreciate it. It means a lot.
Great. Okay. I'll be around if you guys want to stay and chat more, but thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.